I think a really good place to start here will be to talk about the lineage and the history of this movement. And the point that I really want to come across here is that humans and human societies have had a long history of coming together to talk about new ideas about how society should be structured. Humans have a lot of creativity and collective agency in this process of shaping society, and it often looks like taking some space away from mainstream society to gather in a space that will allow for discussions about new ideas that can then spread and permeate through the rest of society. These movements have, through history, been critical and very important in incubating new ideas and new technology. And I think this gives us a bit of an idea about what is actually happening with pop-up cities. My personal assertion is that pop-up cities are a new surface area for this type of experimentation, especially for a lot of the ideas that we're developing in the crypto space to find actual meaningful ground for tangible, in real life experimentation. A lot of the things we're doing are quite heady, they're quite abstract. And so what we've seen already in the last couple of years is that it's kind of fertile ground for tangible applications, for how to live, how to build new tech, and how to ultimately improve society. So I went deep down this rabbit hole. I originally had maybe 20 different examples. I picked 5 just to give us a little bit of a sense for what's happening here. So the first one is the Enlightenment salons in 17th and 18th century France. These were mostly in Paris. They were social gatherings. They were often mostly hosted by women, and they were kind of a safe space for new ideas about philosophy, politics, and science. This was, France at the time was a monarchy, but it was the general prevailing sense of the Enlightenment was, is there actually a new way to structure society? Right now that feels a little trivial, maybe kind of obvious to us, but at the time it was really literally revolutionary to even be talking about ideas of moving beyond a monarchy. And the impact of these environments was huge, right? They spread ideas from the Enlightenment, kind of the classical ideas we think of about liberalism, like individual liberty, freedom, individual rights, human rights, and this is kind of the birthplace of modern democracy. And obviously, if you study the history of the French Revolution, you see that this was critical in making France a constitutional monarchy for a brief moment, and then obviously a full republic. So that's kind of one example that we can harken back to. Another one that's slightly less well known, but I think is potentially even closer to what's happening here, is what's called the Chautauqua Movement. So this started in late 19th century US in a place called Chautauqua in upstate New York, but it very quickly spread throughout the country. So I think it's actually a really cool model for what's happening here. Essentially, it was a adult and kind of family education movement. So every summer in this town, they would bring university professors, they would bring folks and families to come together and teach each other. It was kind of like a long unconference that happened over the course of 1 to 2 months. And it had folks like Henry Ford, who's pictured here, and a bunch of the other kind of big innovators of the time who would come and spend their summers there. And this eventually spread around the country, so pretty much every city in the US had a Chautauqua in the summer. Some of them happened throughout the year. And it actually kind of approximates very closely what's happening with things like Zulu, things like Edge City, Zoo Thailand, where we have these 1 to 2 month temporary gatherings that are then now starting to pick up steam again. So yeah, it's just a really cool example of a small idea that became a national movement. The next one is Black Mountain College, which was a experimental college. It was a reaction to kind of the industrial education movement in the early 20th century. It had a lot of interesting folks like John Cage. Buckminster Fuller actually invented the geodesic dome while he was at Black Mountain College. It was the center of American avant-garde art and poetry, so it influenced a lot of American culture. But again, it was a permanent place, but for most people, their experience of it was that they would go there for 1 to 2 months, they would go deep on some ideas, they would collaborate with other folks who were there, and out of that came a lot of interesting philosophy, art, technology, like Buckminster's work. That's actually him pictured here. It's a little bit pixelated on the screen, but yeah, just really interesting history. It's even less than just 100 years ago. Auroville. So Auroville is an interesting example in India. It's actually a permanent new town that's still going, and it was created as an attempt to figure out a place focused on human unity and sustainable living, and especially human flourishing. There are people that live there full time, but again, for a lot of people, their experience is ephemeral. So they come for a month or two, they stay there, they learn, they develop ideas. At the time, this kind of came out of the 60s, cultural revolution happening in the US. So the hippie movement, a lot of talk about peace and harmony. Obviously, the Vietnam War was happening at the time. It's big. There's 3,000 people, but I think they've had over 100,000 in terms of like folks that have been there. And it's a really interesting experiment that shows that these things can have a lot of longevity over time. And so the last one here is the Sante Fe Institute, which is a little bit of a more contemporary example, but I think gives a really good sense of what's possible here when people come together around a particular concept of study. So SFI is focused on the idea of complexity science. It was started by folks that were part of the Manhattan Project, and it's a space for people to tackle complex problems, and it's a very multidisciplinary research space, which I think is very interesting. They actually incubated a new way of bringing together scientists and tech people and thinkers from a variety of different fields and finding ways to kind of create collaboration points between them. Huge impact. Again, it has influenced a lot of scientific thinking in modern times, a lot of mathematics, economics, biology, and especially computer science. So, and there is one honorable mention, which is Burning Man. I wanted to include this because I think when people think of pop-up cities, this is probably the first thing that people think of. It's a literal pop-up city for 10 months of the year. There's nothing but desert in this place, and then people start building, and for a week there are close to 100,000 people there. It has had a huge cultural impact. It has spawned really a global movement of burns. There are now burns in most regions around the world. It's obviously quite radical in the experience that people have. It's quite different from people's traditional lifestyles. I think, so I've been going for a long time. I do think it's a very interesting experiment, but I do want to call out that I think it's ultimately very different to what we're trying to do. And I think that's important to note because, again, it's like it's an association that people have and that they come to quite easily. But I see the burn as a chance for people to very momentarily kind of LARP or like role play a completely different lifestyle to the one that they currently live. Whereas I think the thing we're trying to do with pop-up cities, and obviously there's infinite variety of what people will do with this format, but it's much more approximating what could life actually look like if it was thoughtfully designed. So that's that. And the question is, so where do we go from here? Our generation has a whole set of new problems. Some of these old institutions or movements were the answer to a prior set of problems. We have our own. There's a lot going on. I don't need to tell you. But we also have new tools. There are things that have been developed in the last couple of decades that have reached maturity, that are now usable. Obvious examples, internet AI and ultimately blockchains, which we believe are a very kind of foundational tool for this kind of experimentation. And we'll get into some of that later. There are new experiments starting to happen. There's new ideas like the network state, there's Zuzulu, there's Edge City, Zoo Thailand. And so I really see these pop-up cities as a way to prototype new solutions, like I've been saying. And each experiment kind of brings us closer and closer to what a resilient, inclusive, and flourishing community could look like.